Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of From Crisis to Horizon, Fighting for Social Housing. Before we get started, we'd like to acknowledge our co-conveners of this event, the Urban Democracy Lab, the Initiative for Community Power, and our student-powered groups at NYU School of Law and Vermont School of Law. Also, thank you to our co-sponsors at Housing Justice for All, NYU Urban Initiative, and the Institute for Public Knowledge. My name is Angelo Pistudo. I'm a second-year law student at NYU School of Law and the conference chair of the NYU Latinx Law Students Association. It's my great pleasure to introduce our event today. Last night, panelists defined some of the problems and began some of the visioning, the horizon setting referred to in our event title that we hope to dive into further today. Our first panel, Defending Tenants Amidst the U.S. Housing Crisis, featured housing lawyers and organizers who daily contend with the coercive systems that bear down on tenants across the United States, from Minnesota to Puerto Rico. They discussed the urgent issues of the increasing financialization and commodification of housing and the urgent need of organizing to build power to challenge and transform our current systems, with impacted communities and tenants leading the way. Our second panel, Building Towards Social Housing in New York, began to explore definitions of what social housing is, the pushes in New York to realize and build it, and the social, political, and economic shortcomings of our current housing system in relation to a model of democratically controlled, decommodified, and deeply affordable housing that is social housing. We have 2 excellent panels planned for today. The first is on local and national organizing for social housing. It asks, where is our organizing today and where do we go? The second asks, since we do not have large-scale social housing in the United States today, yet, what are some international lessons and examples that are inspiring us or should inspire us? We will have our first panel for about 55 minutes, have a short break, and then move into our second panel. We'll have snacks and refreshments in the gallery afterwards during a reception. Now, it's my great privilege to turn it over to our first moderator, Jake Carlson. Jake is an urban and political sociologist focused on democracy, housing, and changing cities. Jake is currently a postdoctoral research associate at Brown University's Spatial Structures in the Social Sciences and the Population Studies and Training Center. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Honored to be here. I have a new job now. I'm now a professor at Kane University in New Jersey, and I am really, really honored to be here with these very, very exciting panelists who I will introduce. So, starting right here on my left, Rene Moya. Rene is an organizer with the Debt Collective and the Los Angeles Tenants Union. He's a former campaign director for the Proposition 21 ballot initiative in 2020 to strengthen rent control in California, and the former campaign coordinator with a statewide community group, ACCE, Alliance for Californians for Community Empowerment. He's worked extensively on tenants' rights, rent control efforts, pandemic era, emergency protections, and social housing. Next, we have Shanti Singh. Shanti has been working full-time in tenants' rights after organizing with renters in private, public, and nonprofit housing, alongside housing justice groups in San Francisco. Was formerly co-chairing the San Francisco Democratic Socialists of America, and works on tenant organizing and social housing issues there. In addition to being a city commissioner for clean municipal energy, chair of the San Francisco Housing Stability Oversight Board, and board vice president of the San Francisco Community Land Trust, and has worked on several San Francisco Board of Supervisors races. Katie Goldstein has been an organizer in the labor, LGBTQ, racial justice, and housing justice movements for over 20 years, and a housing organizer for 16. She's been a tenant organizer here in New York, organizing to preserve at-risk affordable housing, and then became the executive director of Tenants and Neighbors, a citywide tenants organizing group here in New York, where she helped lead powerful coalitions to win important victories for the tenant movement here in the state and city. Currently works for the Center for Popular Democracy as the Director of Housing and Healthcare Campaigns, where she leads the Renters Rising campaign, a mass corporate tenant organizing campaign with over 10,000 members. So, give them all a round of applause. So we're going to organize this conversation today a little bit like a discussion. So first, we are going to start off with, now there is a lot of really exciting organizing and movement going on at the national level for social housing. But also a lot of the exciting work is happening in cities and states. Now, in your view, what opportunities and challenges are there when building social housing at the local level? And how does this relate to the simultaneous need to do something nationally? And let's start with Renee.
I was really hoping someone else was going to start, not myself, but I'll do it. Yeah, I think that we should start by remembering that both at the national level and at the state and or local level, there have always been very different competences when it comes to housing, right? I think we all know that. Earlier, when we were having a discussion prior to the panel today, we were talking about how the federal government has always been good at providing money, but when it came to structuring the regulatory framework through which things like public housing, voucher programs, et cetera, how they have run, that has been where all of the nitty-gritty real kind of work for housing has been. And it's for that reason that generally tenants' rights work itself, housing work, has always been mostly local as opposed to federal or national, although Katie will talk to us a little bit about that in a bit. So now what does it look like to try to organize around social housing when you're trying to do it from the local level? It's a little bit low. Oh, is that fine? The problem, I think, to begin with, is the fact, again, that money is an issue. Quite aside from the fact that a lot of local elected officials want to pretend as though social housing is something that they don't have in their local cities and that it's not their problem. It's very weird to have to tell elected officials that they still have public housing estates in their cities and counties. It's very bizarre to tell them that they actually have some power to be able to regulate, to try to fix a lot of what public housing authorities do in their cities. And so for that reason, whenever tenants do try to organize at the local level just to improve the conditions of the public housing that does exist, i.e. the social housing that already exists in their cities, they don't understand how to do that, right? And so in some way, local elected officials, despite the fact that they have much more power, much more control over what happens to existing social housing stocks in their cities, oftentimes act as though they have no say whatsoever. The second issue, I think, again, this goes back to the money question, is because they don't want to have any money, or they say that they don't have the money for it, they will pretend as though they have absolutely no right to do anything about that housing, even when they know that they have some regulatory power over it. About a year and a half ago, I was organizing with my partner a public housing estate in Los Angeles where the tenants of that building, of that estate, were being pushed out because they were going to be moved either to Section 8 vouchers, so off the public housing estate entirely, or they were going to have to move to another public housing estate in somewhere else in LA County. And mind you, there's not that much public housing left in LA County, so they were not going to have a choice of what community they were going to live in. Or 3, they could move into affordable housing. I'm not going to get into, frankly, what I consider a little bit of a scam when it comes to affordable housing and what it means. But the point is that the tenants themselves did not want to move into that housing despite the fact that it was in their estate alone. And so in that fight, what did I learn from that fight just about a year and a half ago was that, A, the public housing authorities themselves wanted to act as though their hands were tied, which they kind of were because politicians tied their hands. But then 2, the politicians themselves, when we did approach them about these issues, would say, there isn't the money available, and this is why we're bringing in private corporations to build the housing. We own the land still, right? The public housing authority did. But again, the affordable housing developers were the ones who actually had a lot of the control as landlords over these tenants, right? So it is really, I think in some way, and I know others will talk about this in a bit, it is a little bit of a catch-22. Because no one wants to pretend as though they have the responsibility for that land. And when it comes to then developing that, or to try to create a new social housing program, that same sort of dynamic ends up carrying through when it comes to these campaigns. I think I'm going to stop there for now, but I will throw out one final thing, which is that in this country, public housing, social housing is a bad word. It has been a bad word for decades because, frankly, the Red Scare and, a lot of anti-socialist sort of like ideology in this country. For that reason, Public housing in California was gutted in the 1950s with the passage of Article 34. It's an article in the Constitution that actually prevents local governments and or the state from easily developing affordable housing for poor folks. It actually says that if you're going to have any affordable housing that has the majority of the funding coming from the state, that there has to be a referendum, essentially, for you to be able to do that. And so for that reason, we haven't built a single public housing development in California for decades, even prior to the kind of broader sort of disinvestment in public housing that we have nationwide. And so that is another kind of thing that we have to fight against too. That long history that, you know, really stalks the current organizing environment for housing, even though the political dynamics have changed so dramatically in the decades since.
I also realized that I forgot when I sent you my bio to actually put my day job in there, which I guess is kind of probably a little bit relevant. That's my mistake, probably because it came from my day job website. Hi everyone. I work at my day job is I work at Tenants Together. I'm the legislative director there, and we're a statewide coalition of 60 tenants' rights organizations, mostly tenant unions, some legal aid and other housing justice, reproductive justice, sort of intersectional organizations, but mostly we're the coalition of tenants unions in California. And so we've been working a lot on sort of social housing statewide, and one thing that we've really done in the last couple of years especially is a lot of like internal political education with our membership, but also trying to arrive at a definition or boundaries about what social housing is and what it isn't with the entirety of our membership. And, you know, in a state like California, which we have, let's see, 40 million people, 17 million renters, almost, I don't know how, 500,000 at least unhoused folks. There's a lot of people in the mix, but also, I mean, one thing that keeps coming up is, of course, just how different people's organizing environments are, right? So if you're in San Francisco, we've privatized most of our public housing. That's where I live. Renee, if you're in LA, you're still organizing existing public housing. You know, we're out talking about social housing in Fresno or Bakersfield. It's a completely different conversation. The housing typologies are different. The political dynamics are different. But then that also means that some of the demands for land and housing decommodification are going to be different. And so we're trying to, kind of come up with as a coalition, and then also as part of a broader social housing coalition with all the other coalitions in California, because we keep starting new ones every 5 minutes. What is sort of our combined vision around social housing going to be, and how do we actually take, all of the different exciting things that are happening at the local level and bring them up into a statewide campaign? Because I do think, fine, I don't need it. But I do think that particularly with California, we were listening to a panel, Renee and I, with 3 different UN special rapporteurs on housing, reminding us that we're the world's richest subnational jurisdiction. So that's both it's both incredibly frustrating how just little public investment or expenditure there is in housing in general when we have that privilege. And it is a privilege, right? So when I'm in Sacramento and hearing things like, oh, well, we're not getting any budget stuff that could possibly go to anything that would be called social housing because Governor Newsom already spent some money on tiny homes and he thinks that's all he's got in him for this year. That's a real thing that I heard. It is really frustrating because in California, I think we have tremendous opportunity to actually bring all these local campaigns up into a statewide campaign, and we have resources in our state that we're just not using for a number of reasons. I do want to highlight 2 things. I mean, Renee I could also talk a lot about the sort of organizing of tenants who are being pushed into quote unquote affordable housing, including in San Francisco. But I did want to highlight, in terms of what the sort of political landscape is right now from like the local to state, there's a lot of exciting stuff going on, but we don't know how it's going to go yet. So, for example, in Los Angeles, they just passed in November 2020 a big transfer tax on, I think, anything over $5 million called Measure ULA. And of course, there was tons of real estate opposition, but Measure ULA explicitly doesn't just fund, all sorts of different tenant programs and permanent supportive housing, but it also explicitly names and social housing and allocates alternative models of social housing and explicitly allocates dedicated funding, I think 20%, which across the city of LA that can add up to hopefully to some good money. And in San Francisco in 2020, we actually Measure ULA was last year, sorry. In November 2020, San Francisco passed Proposition I, which was a very similar transfer tax. And a lot of what I do with the Housing Stability Fund Oversight Board, which is a mouthful of an acronym, is fighting with the City Hall over that money that the voters approved. So that's to say, there's we have new members at Tenants Together that are like land trusts that are coming from, places where that are really politically hostile environments. Like your Fresnos, your Bakersfields, your Imperial Valleys, et cetera. So the movement is really diversifying and people are employing all of these different strategies, and that's really exciting. And I don't want to ramble on for too long, but we're currently in this situation where, we're housing justice and labor are starting to work together more. This is definitely something that happened in SF. I think it's something that happened with Measure ULA. And it's now something that's happening with the state level. And that's really exciting. And maybe I can get into it more later if we have time, but we have, I think, 4 or 5 different state legislative proposals of varying quality. The ones that I was involved in are the good ones. Around social housing, including one we're doing with the California Labor Federation to tax every short-term rental in the state of California and fund social housing predominantly for low-income people. So we're trying all of these things out. We'll see how they go, but there's a lot that's really exciting about all these different approaches people are taking that's informed by where they are in the state.
Cool. Hi, everyone. It's really good to be here. So I'm going to talk about the national level because I work for the Center for Popular Democracy. We're a national network of power-building organizations all across the country and in Puerto Rico. And we have about 20 affiliates that are organizing around housing justice. And part of what we do is we also organize this campaign called Renters Rising, which is tenants in corporate-owned properties across the country coming together to build power and also to end corporate control of the housing market. And that's where the demand for social housing really came from, right? Is that we're actually trying to put policy meat on the bones of housing for people, not for profit. And so this is really a demand that's coming from tenants all across the country and in very different political landscapes, in Arkansas, in Florida, in North Carolina, in Maryland, in New York, in California. So it's a really exciting moment to sort of see the swell of this mass solution come up. So some of the things that I want to talk about at the national level and some of the challenges that we have is that when we're talking about social housing, we're really talking about a scaled program, right? We're talking about ending the housing crisis and making housing a public good. And this is after it's been highly privatized, highly corporatized, and it's for profit almost everywhere, right? And so this is something that is a huge challenge for us to be talking about as we're talking about building new housing, acquiring housing, and preserving housing, right? And also bringing public housing back into the conversation to say that that's social housing. Well, it's been demonized from jump, right? And criminalized and underfunded. So these are huge challenges that we have in terms of the housing system, but we believe that we're actually up for the challenge if we build enough power that we need. So it's about scale, it's about decommodifying housing, and it's about winning $1 trillion from the federal government. And this is what we're really coming together to do at the national and federal level. This will be hard, not because the government doesn't see their role as giving money to housing, which it does, but because of the lack of state and local infrastructure that exists in order to actually put that money into social housing rather than put it into LIHTC, low-income housing tax credits, for those who are familiar, which is a horrible way of constructing housing, and the for-profit developers that really run our political landscape. So these are huge challenges for us to face, and when we're doing this work, we have to be thinking about what scale and infrastructure are we building for when it's time for implementation, because someday we're gonna win this money for social housing. What are we actually gonna do with it? How are tenants at the table? How are tenants in control? And how are we actually doing this to create decommodified housing, which are huge questions and are gonna require a kind of infrastructure, scale, and power that we don't have yet. I think we're building, but those are the big things in front of us.
Thank you so much. A follow-up question, because I was noticing some connections here. where I just read an article about the Houston Community Land Trust where they got all this money, but now they're running into this issue where the housing that's being built is being built really slowly and really in not great quality by the city public works agency. And so we have this issue of a long, many decades period of the reducing the power of the state through many years of neoliberalism. So even if we can get the money from the federal level, you've got people who are saying, no, we don't want to do it. And so are there any places where you're seeing little bits of hope for local governments where they've been pushed successfully and are doing good work to build back the power of the state to promote housing?
I don't know about good examples, but look, in this country, California approved a ballot initiative to build high-speed rail when I was, I think, in high school. And that thing is not anywhere near finished. There have been cost overruns. I think it's going to run into the $50 billion dollar mark, if I remember correctly. By the time it is built, it'll only cover something like 60% of the original route that it was supposed to have. We don't do public infrastructure well in this country at all, right? And then, of course, you look at examples in Europe where, like with with high-speed rail, for example, where they're carving massive tunnels into the Alps, and they're doing it for a third of the price of what California is doing. I'm not surprised. I'm not shocked that this is the case, right? The only, I think, other thing I would add, and then I want to pass it on over to other folks for the good examples, hopefully, is that we have to remember that for a very long time, actually, housing development in this country has been controlled at the very local level by essentially like local oligopolies, right? In most housing markets. This has been a problem that existed prior to the Great Recession. It's one of the reasons why when folks talk about build, I always tell them the problem is there are very few firms who are actually doing that in your local city. We have to be able to build a state capacity to be able to do that to begin with. But that is a problem that got particularly, overwrought, or it became a bigger problem after the 2008 crisis. And so if we're going to do anything that's going to rely on the private sector to do that, good luck. But if we're even looking at the public sector, we don't have that capacity to begin with. So if there are good examples, I would really love to hear them. We have a problem in this country against any kind of state-led solutions. That is something real that we're going to have to get through. But this is also why I think local examples of states attempting to do social housing, like again in Los Angeles with the transfer tax, that by the way kicks in tomorrow, April 1st, and which by the way also means that a lot of rich people in Los Angeles are desperately trying to sell their homes before the clock runs out tomorrow to try to prevent paying that tax. It models those examples that are going to bring hundreds of millions of dollars every year into the development of social housing are going to be so crucial.
So we need a lot more, right? I mean, I think that's what I want to say. And I think even in the power centers of the housing justice movement, like New York and California, there are lots of examples that can be lifted up, and they're nowhere at the scale that we're talking about, right? If we're talking about ending homelessness, if we're talking about building 12 million homes that's not in a for-profit framework, like we're nowhere close for that happening. And so I really want us to be thinking about as a movement about what kind of actors and what kind of infrastructure and capacity we need for us to be thinking about how this is going to happen, and not in a way that's just going to be like think tanked away, right? Like tenants need to be a part of the table. We need to be a part of the messy process of tenant leadership, tenant ownership, actual, like the things that we care about deeply. That is the way that we're going to win. There are some examples that I've seen. I mean, in Texas, there was recently a victory of a 90-unit building that was owned by a slumlord that was taken away from the landlord and given to the tenants. This is in Houston, Texas, that was taken with the ARPA money, so some of the big federal packages that came through. That's an exciting example. Again, not the scale we're talking about, but it is happening places. And I think as the local and state organizing is going to happen and the demand for social housing increases that we've seen across the board, really around community land trusts mostly, trying to think about how we're scaling up and thinking about acquisition, ownership, cooperatives. These are some of the things that have had a pretty strong track record also in New York. So looking at some of the examples of how that's happened is something that I think we really need to be looking at. But this whole question of scaling up is a huge question for us.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say for it's gotten a lot harder. I was going to say we were talking about signs of hope, but I was going to talk about the bad hope, the one that privatized all the housing. But definitely, like for example, in a place like San Francisco, where Hope is privatized all our public housing, we have barely any left, and I think it's in the process of being privatized right now. It is difficult to make the argument for public capacity because people just kind of think, well, we tried that and it failed. That being said, I mean, I do think that more people are cognizant, like even some people I talk to who won't necessarily say it in public, who are more in the sort of LIHTC development sector, like people are kind of waking up just the way the tenants have woken up in demanding social housing to like the just total inadequacy of this model and the need for, or not, it's not a model, it's just a haphazard Rube Goldberg machine of all sorts of different, models. So I do think that there is a perceptible shift in opinion that's happening, but like he said, it's going to take so much more scaling up. I mean, we have in SF, we have a small sites program that does really great work, and I am on the board of the Land Trust, so of course I'm going to say that in terms of acquiring properties, especially for rent-controlled tenants who are subject to their entire buildings being flipped and all of them being evicted at once because of something called the Ellis Act. I think also we as organizers need to sometimes organize not just in our traditional spaces, but also try to turn everything into an organizing opportunity. What I mean by that is, like, for example, the Housing Stability Fund Oversight Board, worst acronym anybody could have come up with. It's just a boring city policy body, right? And we don't actually have the authority to spend money. We're members of the public. So, when I think about all the folks who are on that, serving on that body with me, when we talk about what are we doing here, what's the point of this, it's like, let's turn this policy body into an organizing opportunity. So we're always asking, we have folks from big labor unions coming in, like all sorts of different labor unions representing low-income workers, representing, the construction trades. We have community groups. We have people coming to our meetings saying, hey, I'm an SRO tenant, an organized SRO tenant. Our elevators haven't been working. We have public housing tenants coming in. And what we're trying to do, even though our very boring nominal task is just to provide annual budget recommendations on social housing that can then will be fought over or ignored or whatever. But I do think that like we're having a conversation in that space about governance, but not a technocratic governance conversation, a governance conversation that's really driven by all of the different needs of our communities. So, I mean, again, like it's a work in progress, but I think those are the kind of things that we're going to need to do.
Can I just actually jump in? Just two things popped into my head as I was hearing the conversation, actually. Number one is that some years ago, I was in a meeting with the chief of staff of a fairly powerful legislator in the state of California, and we were talking about, in a kind of controversial upzoning bill that ended up dying in the legislature that I and others opposed, thankfully. But anyway, in the discussion around the bill, this chief of staff, who publicly had been nominally supportive of this upzoning effort, said to me very clearly, she's like, look, this is not going to do anything. We know it's not going to do anything. Even if we pass this thing, it's not going to build what we need. What the hell do we do? She's like, do we just have to build public housing again? And she said it almost like this is crazy talk, right? She's like, do we have to start building public housing again? And I'm like, yes, actually, that's exactly what you need to do. The fact is that the state does have the capacity to do this. Just over the last, 2 budgetary cycles, California ran into one of I think literally the largest budget surplus in the state's history, swimming in tens of billions of dollars. That was a missed opportunity to be able to use that money for something that could have actually directly housed people. And I think, again, it's part of a broader shift, I think, in the narrative that I think politicians are waking up to the fact that they're going to have to take responsibility for the crisis. But it's the kind of thing that we're going to have to drag them kicking and screaming to do in the same way that we did with the question of rent control in California, that when we started talking again about rent control in 2017, people thought that we were insane. And now the battles that we're having are how much rent control, what type of rent control, not whether or not we need it. That took years of us battling it, and this is how actually Shanti and I got to know each other around those battles. It's going to be the same around social housing. We're talking about a multi-year battle. The final thing I was going to say, I think we also, besides talking about development, we need to talk about how we socialize existing housing as well. The community land trust model is a way of doing that, but I think increasingly we're going to have to talk about how the state ends up intervening to take over currently privately held land, especially, for example, where affordable housing covenants are expiring. There are 10,000 of those units in Los Angeles alone that are expiring in the next few years. All of those units are going to go to market rate housing. We can't say, oh, that's perfectly acceptable, while at the same time we have 60,000 people on any given night in LA County who are sleeping on the streets. I think we have to have that conversation as well.
Yes, I agree. Fantastic. So there are, as we've noted, lots and lots of money behind the current system of commodified housing. There are material underpinnings of it, but there are also very, very deep ideological underpinnings of it. The ideology of homeownership is one of those things that few things run as deeply, especially in the U.S. Many renters aspire to be homeowners someday. Low-income, struggling homeowners who are victimized by the current system also are in some ways attached to their ability to own. And social housing, in some ways sort of threatens that ideology. And so I'm curious, both in your organizing as well as your vision of what social housing is, how does that ideology show up, and in what ways should we fight against that? Let's start with Katie.
Yes, this is a huge question, but I have a couple of things to say about that. Most of the folks that we organize are so insecure and unstable in the market, they will never be homeowners, right? They know that is not something that is a secret to them. They are just trying to figure out how they survive paycheck to paycheck. So we're designing a policy and a program for them, right? For them to be able to have secure, stable, and dignified housing. The next thing that I'll say is that when we talk about homeownership, homeownership is one of the only vehicles to create wealth in this country, right? We have to be real about that, and that's because we have almost no other social safety nets, and so housing as a commodity is the way that individuals create wealth for themselves and for their family and for their future. There are other things that should happen around that, but at the moment, that's what we're looking at. The other thing that when I talk to tenants about why homeownership, right? Why is this so important? It's actually about stability, right? It's about stability and having a say in your life. It's about being able to say when a landlord can come into your apartment, and when somebody can come and fix something, when you know how much you're going to be paying in rent, when is your lease going to be up, things like that most tenants live so at the whim of whatever a landlord wants to do, that trying to figure out how to equalize the relationship is actually something that social housing can do, and it can do for poor people, low-income people, and people of color, immigrant folks, people that are really at the edge of the housing market and are squeezed out and are very close to being houseless or have been houseless, right? That's who we're talking about, and that's who we're prioritizing here. So thinking about a housing policy that actually centers security, stability, dignity, the ability to actually have control over your lives and where you live and your family. That's what we're talking about in terms of social housing. And when we talk about that with our members, they're like, this sounds great. This is perfect. This is actually what we want as part of it. And the only vehicle to get there so far is through individualized homeownership, which has been heavily subsidized by the federal government, enormously so, and is also highly racialized, segregated in a system of racial capitalism. So all of those things exist to make homeownership the path, but if social housing existed in this kind of mass scale and people were actually able to live with security and dignity, I think things would change quite a bit.
So Katie, you took almost everything that I was going to say. But I'll just add briefly to that too. I think one thing that really excites me about maybe shifting the narrative around this, and actually real quick too, I do think certain models, like when we talk to folks who are more oriented towards, even tenants who are more oriented or aspirational towards homeownership, there are things like, if well designed, like TOPA, limited equity housing cooperatives. That's a big thing the Land Trust is working on right now in SF. That can kind of, provide an alternative model to folks who really want that. But of course it is, like you said, mostly about tenure security, and that's renters' rights is about tenure security, and that's really the main reason people are driven to homeownership. I guess the only thing I'll just add on to that is, what is exciting is that even people are seeing more of the intersection between our housing struggles and other sort of demands, I guess social democratic demands mostly, but still really important ones. And so we're seeing more and doing more work across, like the struggle for Medicare for all, or the struggle for better union wages and unionization, and all sorts of like environmental justice, public health, all of these different struggles. They might have different policies that we're all like kind of siloed and working on, but it's becoming less siloed, especially because, yeah, like you said, Katie, it's really just about security and stability. And if your house is the only way you can, I forgot to mention free college. If your house is the only way, home equity is the only way you can send your kid to college or pay for a medical emergency or cancer treatment, et cetera, of course you're going to aspire to home ownership. And until we kind of address the whole thing holistically, we're not going to be able to fix that. But I will, one example, speaking of demanding stuff from public institutions and but also like kind of working intersectionally, we signed onto, and there was this amazing letter of demands that's now becoming a campaign from every single union in the University of California system, and housing justice, environmental justice, healthcare unions, all sorts of different other like allies of the UC unions, not just them themselves, asking specifically for the UC to re-engage in community investment by not just enacting tenant protections but on its housing, but by divesting its $7 billion investment in Blackstone, by using that to build social housing on its public land that is, tenure secure. And basically making a very comprehensive argument that we are like asking for this like holistic community investment. And that's kind of an example, I think, of how we're going to, that's maybe one small example of how we're going to wean people off of thinking of themselves on not their fault as sort of temporarily embarrassed homeowners or just locked out of the system, period.
Yeah, I think a lot of what I was going to say has already been said, but I mean, two things actually. Number one, I am one of these evil homeowners as of a year or two ago, and honestly, it's because you want control over your housing, right? Let's be very real about that. But going back to the original question, the ideology of homeownership, I think, ultimately is an organizing question for us, right? When I was on my Uber ride to LAX to the airport to fly out here to the East Coast for this event just yesterday, I was talking to a tenant, the driver himself. I always do this thing where I start organizing my driver if I'm ever in an Uber, and I kind of started talking about housing issues, and of course, I end up finding out in this quick conversation that the tenant himself had been receiving illegal rent increases, despite the fact that he lives in rent control and is currently in LA. There is a rent freeze. There has been a rent freeze since March of 2020. There are no allowable rent increases whatsoever under rent controlled units. He didn't know that. His landlord had said, you're not covered by rent control, and he took that as gospel. And then we found out that, of course, there are problems with habitability, that he had, mold, whatever, in his units. All these other tenants are facing the exact same issue, what have you. It goes to me back to that question of like, what is it exactly that we're really confronting when we're confronting the issue of landlordism? It is ultimately a question of power, right? And that manifests itself very dramatically so for tenants in a way that it doesn't for homeowners. This is why when we talk about the value of homeownership for a lot of folks, quite aside from the investment of being able to own a home in a very expensive city where prices of land are skyrocketing every single year, it is ultimately a question of tenure, i.e. whether you can stay to begin with, right? And at what price in your unit. And of course, an issue of control. What can you do in that unit while you're living there? Can you paint the walls? He was telling me that he had carpet that hadn't been changed in 20 years. Under LA housing law, he cannot demand that carpet be changed. Even though his daughter is currently affected by it, she has respiratory problems, he can't do that. And in fact, he's asked the landlord if he could rip the carpet out to be able to replace it with wooden floors or what have you. And the landlord has been basically pulling a string for years about this now, right? So that ultimately is what people need in their lives. We have examples where tenants have that as well. And so I would come to the issue of homeowner ideology from a different angle, which is to say we should be giving tenants across this country the same security of tenure and the same security of control over their housing that homeowners enjoy, such that homeownership will no longer be seen as being the default assumption of people. I think this is something that is very easy to say, but we have natural international examples of this. In Germany, the vast majority of people live in rental housing. They don't live in homes that they buy or that they own. We could do the exact same thing here. And I also think, maybe controversially, that we should be looking at examples further south. I know that looking at Vienna and Germany and all these other places is very sexy to do, but there are very important things that have been happening in places like Latin America because of the pink tide. In the last couple of years in Argentina, they've passed a sweeping set of reforms to, again, increase the control and tenure of tenants over their housing. In Venezuela, again, maybe not a sexy example to pull out for people. Not only have they developed new housing, they've actually started to pass a series of tenant laws over the last few years that make it virtually impossible for you to push tenants out of their housing. That actually is exactly the kind of conversation we need to be having to ensure that tenants can have that same security and control over the homes that they live in. If you provide that to tenants, they're not going to have a reason to go through the, frankly, I don't know, bizarre and very trying sort of system that people have to get into to be able to own a home, especially if they're black and brown in this country that has never made it easy. This country has never made it easy for black and brown people to own a house, and we still do not. We should not be, I think, trying to fix that problem. We should be trying to fix it from the perspective of tenants to begin with.
Thank you so much. So, the social housing movement is very different than in the past few years. I mean, it seems like it's really, really growing. And when things grow, more people get interested. And so I'm curious to what extent you're worried about the issue of co-optation. And I think you probably have lots of examples of this, but social housing has now become a buzzword in a way that it hasn't before. And I think there's like sort of two dimensions to co-optation. One is that people start using the language of the movement in ways that it didn't originally intend. But then there's also the possibility of diluting the original goals of the movement. I'm curious to what extent you're seeing this show up and how much it concerns you. Let's go ahead and start with Shanti.
Oh God, so much. Renee and I talk about this all the time. So, and I know we're over time, so I'm going to try not to I could talk about just this for an hour. But yeah, I mean, I think part of that, the optimistic side of me is that that's just what happens when you reach that initial goal of that initial success and sort of just awareness, which is where we are right now. And that's also why, I mean, we're definitely thinking about, it's not that our tenants need the least political education about social housing. They're defining it. It's our legislators and the general public and the whole housing industrial complex that needs political education about social housing. And that's what we're focusing on now because yeah, there is going to be co-option, and we are definitely seeing quite a lot of that in California, where there's sort of this, people are trying to slap the word social housing on, public-private partnerships potentially. People are trying to slap the word social housing on housing that's only exclusively for middle-income people and not for any low-income people because that's the only thing that quote-unquote pencils out. A lot of this is going to happen. And I think a lot of the reason that we are doing coalition building, not just like in California, across all these local jurisdictions, but also why we're now increasingly, including all three of us here, involved in national kind of organizing, not just at the federal level, but I mean like translocal national organizing, like San Francisco is talking to LA, is talking to Seattle, is talking to DC, is because I think we are concerned about co-option and really need to push through that and make sure that we have a really solid definition of social housing that's coming from the base. And I could go on about this forever. I won't. But the last thing, part of the reason this is even on the policy and legislation side, two of the pieces of legislation, I'm going to say the good ones because I helped write them, but that we're putting forward at the state level does have, it's sufficiently broad to encompass existing public housing, new public housing, land trusts, Vienna models, etc. But we are very explicitly trying to put a definition out there into state law so that we know not just what social housing can be and are flexible to a degree within reason about that, but we're also very clearly trying to draw a line in the sand about what it is not.
God, I could go on and on about this. And in fact, I do on Twitter, and people get pissed off. I think part of it is we have to be very, I think, honest about our horizon. And I mean that from like an organizer's perspective. Some years ago when we were talking about rent control and everyone was battling about rent control, at the time, a lot of my core comrades that I work with in the movement were like, okay, now we can leave the rent control battle to other people to deal with. Now we have to start talking social housing. That was 5 years ago now. And in those 5 years, people have started to talk about social housing, right? And I think, like Shanti says, there have been a lot of already sort of big fights in California, at the very least, around what that means. To me, it's frankly ludicrous for anyone to talk about social housing that doesn't prioritize the, again, 160,000 people who on a given night experience homelessness in California. And again, it's closer to 500,000 in a given year. To me, building any kind of social housing that doesn't start by saying we're going to tackle the greatest, frankly, social crime of the age to some extent in this country is an absurdity. And I don't want to have a conversation about building social housing for anyone at 100% of area median income if we're not still, first off, talking about the people who need it absolutely the most. And then, of course, the next group of people right below them, all of the tenants who are possibly facing eviction and going into the pipeline into homelessness, right? I know Katie will probably talk about this a lot, so I'm going to try to wrap this up in my portion. But I will say one thing, which is that, when people talk about successful models of social housing, let's say abroad, in places like Vienna, you have to remind folks who look at that example and want to use it to pass a watered-down version of it here in the United States, that the only reason why the Vienna model works is precisely because the state has so deeply penetrated every single aspect of the housing market such that the state can intervene with the money that it has to be able to build, socialize, etc., the existing housing. When I think it's like upward of 90% of the housing market in Vienna itself is either directly socialized or deeply regulated, that should be the model that we're actually aspiring to, and not this frankly half-assed vision that a lot of people have of what we should expect here in the United States, which is that social housing should be able to compete with the private market. Social housing has to compete with people buying up their homes and or private developers building it. That is never going to work. We should be very honest about it. There has not been a single successful international version where that has been the case. All of them have required the state taking a very heavy hand and saying, not only are we going to develop social housing, not only are we going to socialize that land, we're also going to ensure that people in private housing at market rates are still going to have a big sort of deciding factor. The state is going to play a deciding factor in how that works out. Anything else to me is frankly insufficient, and I don't want to have any time for it.
I love that. I love bringing the state. And I think part of this is like thinking about not the privatized state, right? Not the corporate state. We're actually talking about public good, right? And I think that the challenge that we have of people being like, social housing is going to be everything. We're going to do everything. Social housing, we love it. Is that we're actually talking about a system not run by for-profit developers, which is how all affordable housing construction, but affordable housing construction is currently run in this country. And so we're saying that this is going to be different. And that's going to be a big deal, and that's going to be a big fight, and that's going to be a big fight in narrative, that's going to be a big fight in organizing, it's going to be a big fight in the actual developments themselves, it's going to be a big fight in who's at the table. All of that is going to be huge, but we really need to get this ideology that a for-profit, privatized way of solving this crisis is the way that we're going to solve the crisis. Just not true, right? The other thing that I want to say is that the left has not done the supply thing well, right? Mostly because everybody that says the solution to the affordable housing crisis, supply and demand, right? Which to me is just like a neoliberal talking point, right? Of course, building luxury condos is not going to reduce people's rent, right? That is like so obvious. And it's the way that we talk about how to solve the affordable housing, the housing crisis writ large, right? Is there's just not enough homes for people. We know there are enough we know that there are. It's the rising rents, it's the corporate control, it's the privatization, it's all of these other things that have impacted the housing market. But we, on the left, are going to have to figure out how we're saying we're actually talking about supply. We're talking about new housing. We're not just talking about rent control, right? We're saying that we need new programs, new way of doing that, and that's going to be hard because mostly we've been pretty against the new supply stuff that's come through because the programs are pretty terrible, right? And so we're talking about creating something new and also advocating for supply, which we need to do to solve the housing crisis. But there's also a danger of falling into this neoliberal framework. And I think we don't want to do that because we don't believe it. But we also want to make sure that supply is a part of the conversation that we're having. And so it's a new thing.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. We are unfortunately going to have to cut it there. But everyone give a round of applause for Katie Goldstein, Renee Moya, and Shanti Singh. Thank you all so much, and I believe our next panel is up.
Thank you. I get to ingratiate myself to you all. Of course. Yeah, just there. You're okay fielding some questions on the fly from me? You're ready. Yeah, yeah. Macon's good though. But we can have audience bring other panelists. Just give us 1 second. We're getting some tech issues sorted out. We'll be right with you. Welcome everyone. Welcome everyone also who's on Zoom. It sounds like there are perhaps many of you out there in the Zoom space watching us. I am John Whitlow. I'm going to be moderating this panel discussion, and our panel is grappling with this question of what other places we can look to for inspiration and changing the way we think about social housing in this country. It's a big question. Luckily for us, we have 3 extremely heavy-hitting panelists who I'm going to introduce to you very briefly. I urge you to look in their bios for more information about them. On my far left, we have Amy Chu, who's a senior research analyst at the Center for Popular Democracy. Next to Amy is Celeste Hornbach, who's a director of housing policy at the New York City Comptroller's Office. And directly to my left is Gianpaolo Baiocchi, who is a sociologist and is the director of NYU's Urban Democracy Lab, one of the organizers and sponsors of this event. First question is for you, Amy. Where do you look internationally and historically for inspiration as we seek to make social housing a reality here in the United States?
So I actually prepared some PowerPoint slides. So I don't know if I could just get into it. And some of it is a little bit context setting too. So yeah, I'm a senior research analyst at the Center for Popular Democracy. And like my colleague Katie Goldstein probably already mentioned in the last panel, we're supporting affiliate organizations in building a national tenant union called Renters Rising of tenants and corporate landlords. And we did release a report last year that tries to put out our vision for model social housing policy and our definition of social housing. So when we look at international examples, we're also looking at it from that lens. And the report does feature a bunch of international examples and how they line up according to what we think social housing should be. So that's actually how I wanted to start it off, just kind of laying out like what our definition of social housing is, if that's okay. So I had some visuals. I don't know if this is gonna work, but okay. Thank you.
Whoa, look at that.
Yeah, so I had a lot of background slides, which I'm not gonna do because I assume a lot of you are already familiar with housing justice issues or involved in the tenant movement. Can you raise your hand if you are? Okay, cool, great. So I love to say like, oh, next slide, please. Just like in California and in the Bay Area where I live, you can just click through really fast. Like there's tons more vacant houses than unhoused people, which points to how the market is basically failing to meet people's needs. Yeah, sorry, just please click through like 20 clicks through all this. Thank you. And then even in hot markets like San Francisco, vacancies have increased in the last 15 or 20 years, especially in the sector of like luxury rentals, vacation homes, like second homes. And next slide, please. Luxury development is booming. We all know, but it's focused on the high end. And we also know that there's an unhoused crisis everywhere throughout the country. So yes, please just click through this. Thank you. So why is this happening? Why do we have mass homelessness alongside empty houses? Click through again. So yes, there are a lot of structural reasons for this. There are reasons that gentrification is happening, and it has to do with structural economic forces and government policies that are promoting these trends. So next slide. So at CPD and Renters Rising, the way we like to frame it is that corporate control over our homes is the root of the problems in our housing market, a situation where in the last 50 years, speculation has really increased in speed and scale because of government policies that are deregulating banking, that are linking Wall Street to housing. This is called the financialization of housing. I'm not going to get into it, but it's just unprecedented historically, how stuff is being traded, leading to the subprime mortgage crisis, et cetera, and now corporate landlords are targeting Black and brown communities for rent gouging and eviction. And as we know, for-profit developers just don't hit the mark when it comes to building affordable housing. Next slide. And then meanwhile, we have government policy, which very sadly has been cutting spending for affordable housing. And next slide, please. Even as they are spending most housing subsidies on the rich in terms of higher income homeowners, the largest corporate landlords and investors, such as through the mortgage income tax credit, the mortgage income tax deduction. So what do we need to do? The government needs to step up and take responsibility by creating social housing and ensure housing is a human right, like education, water, healthcare, food. It's something that everyone needs for a basic need. It's not like buying jewelry or some other commodity. And how will we get there? Organize and protect renters and low-income residents. So thank you for bearing with that long introduction. So next slide finally is like our definition of social housing. So basically, as housing justice organizations of low-income renters across the country, we define social housing as housing that is permanently and truly affordable to lower-income residents, that is under public ownership or democratic community control, and that may never be resold for profit. It's democratically managed through the input of resident associations and tenant unions. Next slide. And just to explain, this means it's permanently decommodified. That's what we mean by decommodified. Never resold for profit, cannot be resold to for-profit investors, always under community public control. So it's very important for us to say, and this has been brought up already, the quality public housing produced and owned by the government is what we consider a form of social housing. In our vision for social housing, we prioritize the lowest income residents and communities of color first, and that means expanding quality, accessible public housing under resident management and addressing like the legacy of racist neglect and criminalization and punitive treatment of residents in public housing. So we believe in prioritizing those groups first in order to lift up housing standards for everybody, even as we aim for a really large scale of social housing. So next slide. So thinking about social housing, we don't just mean like the buildings themselves. Like when we talk about the social housing we mean like a whole housing system of creating those buildings from start to finish. And that includes like how to finance them and how to maintain them. So this is like a pipeline that's really more like a fan or a flower that shows the pieces of how we define social housing, starting from the land acquisition, focus on public banking for public land banking, using other kinds of financing that don't involve for-profit Wall Street investment. So that could be like mansion taxes, like what happened in LA. It could be like public banking. And then the other ones have to do more with acquisition, construction, and maintenance pipelines. But I wanted to especially highlight the financing aspect because I think that there are really important things that international models are doing about financing that we should pay attention to. So in terms of your question about which models to talk about first, I'm just going to say one because I don't want to take everyone else's time up, and I know you're going to talk about Vienna, but I wanted to talk about Finland. So next slide. So as many of you all know already probably, Finland is the only country in the European Union where homelessness is decreasing. And it's on track to eradicate homelessness by 2027. And this is true even now in the pandemic. Whereas, you know, in other places, like maybe it's suddenly decreased a little in the UK or the US when we had like temporary shelters for unhoused people, like at the beginning of COVID. But then as those shelters have closed down, homelessness has just actually increased even more in other places. So they're on track, and they're very famous for their housing first policy, which gives unhoused people an apartment and counseling as soon as they need them. No preconditions like having a job, like being sober. It's just get in housing first and then have support to deal with other situations in your lives. So that's been publicized in media a lot. But what doesn't get as much attention is that Finland has a very, very strong social housing program that ensures affordable homes are available in the first place to give to people who need them. And so The director of the architect of Housing First has been quoted on trying to say this, that they replaced existing shelters and hostels with permanent housing solutions. And the most important thing is having a long-term plan on providing affordable social housing to get rid of homelessness. So this diagram basically breaks down the different parts of how they have established their social housing pipeline. They have a constitutional right to housing. That's great. And so in terms of finance, they have a public bank called Munifin that's the main investor in social housing, and it gives loans for housing development. It's owned by state and municipal governments. This is a public bank, and it's also owned by their public sector pension fund. So they're using pension funds to do this. They also have an agency that gives other kinds of supports through loans and interest subsidies and grants for energy upgrading. In terms of land, they have a very big land bank. The city government of Helsinki owns like 70% of the land, which it leases for creating social housing. So again, it just leases land from the land bank. It doesn't sell it, it keeps it publicly owned, and it uses this again to like keep the prices low. It has a public construction company that builds the social housing, and local government, not nonprofits, are the largest owner and provider of social housing in the country. So that's its like pipeline system, and then besides that, they have good tenant protections. They also have other good social safety nets, like healthcare being free and affordable for all at the same time. And they also have a huge scale that they do this on, which is on a future slide that I won't bother to flip through right now, but just for comparison, and when it comes to scale, if you compare like Helsinki with Detroit, or if you compare Vienna with Philadelphia, just the sheer, they have like 10 times or 20 times more social housing and public housing than we do for the same population size. And then that's really important for controlling the whole market. So again, I don't want to take everyone else's time, but I just wanted to say about Vienna that, there's two kinds of social housing in Vienna. There's like the municipally owned kind that's directly owned by the government, and there's a kind owned by the limited profit associations, which are kind of a little bit like the nonprofit sector getting involved. And they have laws that actually cap the amount of profits those limited profit housing associations can earn, and they have to reinvest the profits into building new housing. But that said, that like nonprofit or NGO model is a form of kind of like neoliberal private partnership that has developed like more since the 1980s, when most of the social housing started out as mostly publicly owned. So, people talk about like having a mixed income financing model that's like revenue neutral. They point to Vienna. Well, the fact is historically Vienna got its social housing because it expropriated empty housing from rich people, and it taxed the rich. Like, it was a redistribution system geared at the people who needed housing the most when it started during like the Red Vienna period. And this later stuff around having the nonprofit sector involved, those houses are actually less affordable than the original municipally owned public housing. And that's true today. Like, you have to pay a big down payment to get into the nonprofit or the limited profit association owned housing, so it's less affordable and less accessible. And the most affordable stuff remains the public housing. So just wanted to draw that distinction.
Thank you, Amy. So Celeste, Vienna's come up a couple of times. Amy just started talking about it. I think in the last panel, Renee went so far as to characterize it as sexy. And I think we've all been there. I was going to ask you. You were just there, right? Recently.
Yes,
okay.
And with like a number of people in the room, and John Paulo as well.
Cool.
So.
Okay. I'm just teeing it up for you.
Yes, I appreciate it.
Yeah. So could you just tell us a little bit more about what lessons we can draw from Vienna and maybe other places too, if you want to go there as well.
So it did come up quite a bit in the earlier panel, and I just wanted to kind of pull some things out, I think, and build on them a little bit. I think, importantly, Renee brought this up, but that social housing examples across the world have worked when they are a large sector of the market. And the history of public housing, at least in New York City, really is that it was seen as a replacement sort of to go alongside the private sector industry and replace the slums on like the Lower East Side and other parts of the city. But it really wasn't supposed to be a competition. with the existing housing market, right? So it is such a small percentage of the overall housing supply in the city, and is not really supposed to. Part of the reason that it is like really just targeted to low-income people is so that it isn't competing with like what is the private sector development. And that just isn't the case in Vienna when 80% of the population is eligible for the housing. And you can see that too in like the design and the beauty of the housing that exists and the amenities that are available to the tenants. It is really you can't tell the difference so much. You can because it was a socialist project, so they put on the buildings that it is social housing, but it is like throughout the city. It's dispersed in all different neighborhoods. It is not concentrated, and it is just as beautiful as the private housing that exists there. So I think it is very difficult to try to bring back wholesale lessons from a place like Vienna, because another thing that came up is that there is just a robust social safety net there, right? It's far from a socialist country, but most people have a pension. There is socialized medicine. There is just a social safety net that does not exist here. And so the concept, and Katie talked a lot about this, but the concept that you need to extract profit from your housing just doesn't exist in the sort of ideology in Vienna, and probably in lots of other places, I'm sure, where there are large-scale social housing like Finland, and like social democracy. So one story that has really stuck out to me, we visited a development that was one of like the example Amy brought up, a more expensive sort of model, and not the traditional public housing that was built during the Red Vienna period, but a cooperative that was designed by like a group of people through a public sort of like RFP process. And I mean, it was a beautiful, beautiful building. It had a sauna, it had like a rooftop shared kitchen and a rooftop garden. And they were explaining the sort of like buy-in process to us. And the value of their investment actually depreciates over time. And they had to kind of explain that concept to us more than once, because it is just so counterintuitive to how we think about housing and the value growth of housing, and that being like a sort of just essential component of our vision. Even in our limited equity models that we have in New York City, of which there's like about 30,000 units, about 1,300 buildings, and that doesn't. I talk about Mitchell-Lama separately because they have a slightly different appreciation regime, but it's a limited equity model, right? So it's set, it should be fixed. It's about a couple percentage points a year that the value goes up over time. If you leave and you sell, you probably have to give some of that back to the co-op, like with a flip tax, but you are earning money on your investment. And this like sort of similar example in Vienna, you put a down payment in, and then it depreciates a certain percentage over time because you lived there and you used it. And so it's trying to think about that's like the depreciation value of lots of things. It's an accounting principle, right? Like a lawnmower loses its value over time. Like a car loses its value over time because you used it and it's not so valuable anymore, and you got value out of the use. And I think that there just is there's like a lesson there to me too around the deep level of political education and sort of like retraining we all have to do of our brains to get to a place where like what we're really prioritizing is the safety, the security, the long-term tenancy. Because another small like kernel of a thing that is just so different is that you don't really have leases in the sense that we have leases in social housing. It's like that's a tenure for life. You move there, and like if you leave, you leave. But there isn't this like annual renewal process that happens. There isn't a recertification of your income. Like there's just a very different framework of stability that's like central to it. And so I think there's a lot of things that it's hard to pick up and say we want to adopt their exact MIH policies that they have there that require 66% of, upzoned housing to be subsidized, because that doesn't really work within our legal frameworks. But there are lessons, I think, to think about just how we embed that into I think push ourselves, a little bit too, to think more expansively, and to take it from somewhere where this has really worked at scale.
Thanks. Got to think about that further. That was sort of mind-blowing, the depreciation part. Gianpaolo, I want to ask you how we should think of, or how we might be able to fit or retrofit some of these models from other places to the U.S. context.
Oh, thanks for the generous question. So I'm going to actually repeat a lot of things that have been said by everybody, and this is me acknowledging it rather than me stealing organizers' ideas. But so Jake and I, we are involved in one part of the social housing struggle in the U.S., which is we're trying to figure out the institutional arrangement where we can build social housing and graft it onto a neoliberalized, weak public sector that's real estate addicted in this country. So we look at this thing historically. So we talk about social housing 1.0, which is Vienna, post-World War II, big public sector kind of action. Certainly there's a lot to learn from that. We talk about 1.5, which is the community land trust, the freedom farms, the housing cooperatives in Uruguay, for example, where it's bottom-up efforts, local struggles, people decommodifying things on the fly and then looking for support. And then to this generation that we are hoping to build here, as we were talking in the previous panel, and now we have this sort of puzzle where we're going to have to build locally, and the struggles are local, but there's going to have to be federal money at some point to address the scale of the problem, right? We're all talking about a system of social housing, not a cooperative, not a particular land trust, not a particular Mitchell-Lama. So for us, the question is, how do we do that? And sort of where we are, and this is, I'm going to make up a new phrase, but echoing what Renee was saying, I think we want to get to Vienna, but we got to Uruguay our way there, which is we got to look, the Uruguay cooperatives comes out of the labor movement, comes out of the tenants movement. It was hard fought, and they built one example, then another, then they found funding for the cooperatives, and the federal funding eventually came. So now that the FUCVAM in Uruguay is extensive, it doesn't meet the scale of the problem, but it provides one kind of path, as opposed to us looking at the welfare state and wishing, boy, sure wish we could go back in time. And thinking historically, just as to something that's been said over and over, but I'll say it again, we were looking at some New Deal stuff. In the New Deal slogan, 1/3 of the country is ill-housed. We have 100 years of private market incentives, and 1/3 of this country is still ill-housed, if not more, right? So we want public action. We want robust public action. We want public action that's accountable to communities. We want action that has the face of our movements, right? We're not talking about a giant top-down technocratic effort, and we want that support. And so I think for us, the question is, what are the bits and pieces that we do? The Social Housing Development Authority idea is one of them, but there's lots of ideas out there for sort of like transitions to this other system.
Thanks. So I last week was in Berlin, mainly to study housing policy and the tenant movement there. And I went in part because a number of us, including people in this room, are working on creating a legal framework in which tenants could unionize, sort of borrowing principles from the labor movement and labor law in the United States and elsewhere. Tenants could unionize, bargain collectively with landlords over the terms and conditions of their tenancies. So I met with a German tenant activist and asked her about this framework and if she was familiar with it. And this is also an example of how little research I did prior to going. She said, yeah, we've had tenant unions in Germany since, and I was kind of on the edge of my seat thinking she's going to say, like, I don't know, 1950. When she said since the 18th century. And I was sort of mind blown by that. And I guess I'm wondering and curious to hear all of your thoughts on this. It feels like to get to a place where we have widespread social housing in the United States, we need a really massive organizing push, primarily among tenants. And so I wonder if you could talk about what forms tenant organizing has taken in other places, and perhaps what some effective models of tenant organizing have been that have led to decommodified housing. If anybody who wants to go.
Invite that question.
Awesome, thank you.
So I've never been to Sweden, nor have I visited them, but I've read that they have a very long 100-year history of tenant organizing and tenant unions there. And they had their like Million Homes movement during the 1960s and 70s, where they went from having like slum conditions in housing and just a very low standard of living to lifting up their whole population into middle class, basically, because they created quality social housing. But this was like, from what I understand, kind of like a grassroots effort, because they had massive unemployment. So they had like workers' unions get involved and worker cooperatives be like, we're going to build housing that's affordable housing. We're going to build housing cooperatives. So they had like a massive drive of construction that was not just from the government, but that was from like straight out of their cooperative movement, and build like tons of housing co-ops. And they had an interesting debate at that time of like, are we trying to solve our housing crisis through home ownership versus rentership? And they chose rentership because they thought it would be more collective. And at the time, like the cooperative movement there was apparently like the less leftist vision, because of this issue of people who have co-ops might be incentivized to later sell them off or buy them out. And as it turned out, decades later, they had neoliberal law reforms that allowed people to sell off their cooperatives and privatize them. But yeah, that was interesting because there was a big tenant movement for decades before that, but they didn't just wait for the government to do it, basically. And personally, I think Vienna is a very interesting model too, because it just shows like what's achievable at the city scale. Like, yeah, they get like federal subsidies now to maintain their housing, but when they set up their system, kind of like the whole country was a mess because it was overrun by civil war. There was all these refugees, like there's like coups and all this like complicated history, but then somehow at the city level, because they had a universal vote and they elected like radicals into power, they were able to achieve that at a city scale. So personally, I'm like very inspired by like the LA mansion tax example, because it's like some of our cities have a lot of resources. We could tax people to like fund stuff.
I mean, I can give maybe a New York example, which is what I know best, even though I spent a week in Vienna. I mean, I think like I'll talk a little bit about Mitchell-Lama, which I referenced earlier, which is a limited dividend housing program at the state level. And there existed in some form prior to the passage of that in the 50s. But basically, these were union-sponsored cooperatives, and through like pension fund investments and union-built co-ops, that created like maybe somewhere between 100 and 200,000 units of housing in New York City, which is like a pretty big scale, about like half of how much public housing there is. So I think so much of it too is around like ongoing with the union-sponsored cooperatives. A lot of them have just gone private, and they now sell on the Lower East Side for like millions of dollars, and it's a real shame, and it's very sad. The Mitchell-Lama co-ops that a lot were sponsored by unions too, but were a little bit later and had more government restrictions. About 90% of them, of the cooperatively owned, have not gone private. They have the option at the end of like the loan term, and most of them have decided not to, because there is actually like existing solidarity in those communities and a real like understanding that if we exit this program, right? Like, okay, if we sell, we get a lot of money, but actually what we want to do is live here. We want to stay in our community that now has like gentrified and land prices have gone up so much that we couldn't stay here if not. So we have a lot of things to learn from, and I think to look back on from like just sort of local examples as well. But to John Paulo's point too, I think like we can't assume that we're moving back to the sort of like large scale federal investment from like that was available at that time. And I also would say importantly, if you look at the like sort of how these buildings were financed, they didn't need ongoing public investment. They had partial tax exemptions and loans that were paid back over a period of time. Land is just so expensive now in all parts of the country, but in particular in cities like San Francisco and New York, that is impossible. You have to deeply, deeply subsidize any affordable project with hundreds of thousands of dollars per home in order to make them affordable to low-income people. And so I do think that there's a corollary part here, which is how do we limit those speculative behaviors, right? So that we can get the cost of land back in some relationship to how a normal human being, not just the like 1% of the 1%, can afford to live in. So I do think like thinking about tenant protection, thinking about rent control, thinking about actually really going after landlords who are operating housing at substandard conditions and fining them and taxing them, and making the sort of business models that rely on that, having people live in bad conditions not feasible, so that the cost of land and the cost of housing gets back in line with, what it takes to actually operate it for human beings.
Just to add on to that, I think there's actually super exciting organizing happening in the U.S. today. I think the connection between reparations, defund the police, abolition, housing, I feel like that's a very combustible and powerful social justice coalition. It seems like that's what's catching fire. When I look, just to look to the welfare state story a little bit, I think part of the story there is that they had these corporate structures set up by the unions, which is everyone has a voice in the doing of everything. I think of the Million Homes campaign in Sweden as driven by unions because union members needed places to live. And so when in Latin American examples, we have lots of nice coalitions of tenants movements building power with squatters movement alongside with new movement, environmental movements, indigenous movements. So it feels like there's a combustible mix because everyone has to live somewhere, and the interests on that side of the table of owners, of people extracting profit from the land, are really clear, right? It's really clear for us to make an alliance. But I will say, it seems to me that one of the most exciting things I hear about the U.S. now is when we're connecting with labor. The historic examples of Latin American welfare state was when labor brought its muscle to bear. So many times in the last however many years, I've been to some shady social housing developer situation, some dodgy nonprofit, and they'll say, let's get the unions out of the room so that we can lower the cost of the housing we're going to build for our mixed income scam, when in fact, we should be lowering the price of land, not the price of labor, right? As Celeste is saying, why are we paying these inflated prices? Why are we putting that in our spreadsheets when we're trying to figure out how we're going to make them pencil out?
Thanks for that. I have a question. It's actually, a question that I'm borrowing from the previous panel around the sort of ideological and material pull toward private home ownership that seems to be such a major obstacle to social housing in this country. I wonder if you all could take a crack at answering how you think we might dislodge it, but kind of looking at it through the lens of international examples where it seems like just the context is so different. I know that's a tricky question, but by the way, we're out of the prefabricated question zone. So if the pauses are longer, that's what's happening.
I'll give you guys time to warm up because I. Okay, so we are addicted to real estate. It's a problem. When we think of families building wealth, intergenerational wealth, stability, the only thing we think of is home ownership. Families' wealth in this country is tied up with that. Families' wealth is tied up with speculation in that. And if you look at social welfare states, Finland is a homeowner society. People have real estate wealth. But if you look at Sweden, Germany, people have savings. People have other kinds of safety nets. So part of our breaking with this addiction is going to have to think about other ways to create wealth. I think, we, in our context, we'll have discussions about reparations sometime, and someone will raise their hand and say, look, we need to do right by black families that have been cut out of the real estate market. Why are you now not going to have property anymore? It's like, well, first of all, I wish we're not going to have property anymore. But second of all, how can we talk about doing right by communities collectively in a way that's not individual transfer? And then when we talk to people in other countries and we explain to them, well, our politicians are tied to the real estate interests because their tax bases depend on the price of real estate to fund the schools, people's eyes, it just pops a fuse because it's a nonsensical, insane system. So I think we have to break that too. I think getting real estate out of politics and those kinds of will be a couple of the steps.
Great answer. Yeah, that was a double whammy question. I think that the easy answer to that question is just that, like we were talking about what people's fears are on the last panel, and just to give people hope that, like, hey, in other countries, like, people who are renters, they feel secure, they feel empowered, they can pass on, like, inheritance rights to their descendants, they can paint their walls, they can do renovations for cheap, they can get repairs. Like, it's not like this is not the only system, and that might work better for you than home ownership, because no matter what we do, there's just going to still be, like, millions of people who are not going to be able to afford a home in this country. And what's the option for them? So I just remember, like, interviewing with this resident in Vienna about their social housing experience, and they were saying how, in the last couple of decades, there have been all these neoliberal rollbacks in Vienna against, like, especially services for the elderly or people with disability or like pension benefits, but social housing is like the last stronghold that no one is going to give up, because that means so much to them in terms of stability. Like, that is, and people in Vienna, like, they have lower median incomes than us. Like, they have like a 30K median income or whatever. And for me, I'm just like, what's the point of having dollars when I'm stressed about retirement and I have no stability? Like, what do we think wealth is? Like, what is the worth of, like, these dollars from our home equity if it doesn't actually translate into, like, peace of mind or health or just, like, a good standard of living? So to me, that's the lesson from these other countries. Like, just the example that this is not the only way. I also just wanted to say that there are hybrid, I don't want to get into it, but there are social hybrid home ownership models from other countries like Singapore. I will say about Singapore that the way they got their social housing there is because they expropriated publicly. Like, there are communists who came from Malaysia who took over Singapore's government and set things up where they expropriated land to make that system happen when they set it up. But anyway, when it comes to the US though and making it relevant here, I just think that, like, really kind of explaining how CLT, like community land trusts and co-ops, with their limited equity, like, they do protect people from foreclosures. They do, like, support, like, people's savings and stuff like that. And yeah, I totally agree with, like, thinking about other social safety nets, thinking about our government's priorities and the kinds of things that the government wastes money on. Sorry, this is a non sequitur, but I also just wanted to say about how do we get there in this country and the kinds of resources it takes from the government. There are people in this room who worked on this great report with, I think, Community Services Society on 20 pipelines for social housing in New York, which I love, because it concretely was like, we already have this land banking system that has lots of public land. The problem is they just sell it to developers who are private developers instead of using it for social housing. We have thousands of units that way. We already have tons of homes in tax foreclosure that used to go to making co-ops, and then they tweaked it so it doesn't. But like, there's already like resources that we could be using, and I think we need to think about how to make use of those existing ones. From Los Angeles, like Renee said, there's those expiring LIHTC properties. There was a LIHTC property where the tenants have organized for 3 years in Hillside Villa. They got LA City Council to decide to take it by eminent domain and make it into permanent public housing. Now that's one building, but there's many other buildings in LA so that could be in that situation. So, you know, that's not on the scale of like 60% of all housing, but it's a good start. And we already have like, it just makes me really angry that there's public land banks in many cities in the US, but they just pass it through to for-profit developers that gentrify our neighborhoods. Like, those entities could just use it for social housing. Like you said, land cost is a big problem, but hey, that would cut the land cost a lot to actually land bank and land lease in a way that influences regional planning for people's needs.
I would just add on the sort of connection we're making between the labor movement and the housing movement. A lot of how, you know, obviously the history of Red Vienna and like the first wave of social housing development was done by socialists in power. But when it sort of post-World War II really got baselined into the economy, it was really a sort of like a monetary policy that allowed the country to be more competitive because firms could compete internationally because they could pay their workers less because they had stability in housing. And a lot of folks in the labor movement don't necessarily I think have that vision. And I think there's a lot of sort of what's good for the goose is good for the gander thinking, and trying to ensure that the industry still exists, right? And I think that is makes it more difficult to build partnerships for sure. But I just do think there sometimes, you know, there's talk of well, you can raise wages or you can build affordable housing, right? But if you don't actually have a sort of price control on that housing, the wages are lost. This happened in Florida. The Disney World workers won a huge wage increase. But I mean, this is a specific example, right? Because it's such in that area, it's such a big employer. But the wages increases were mostly lost because the landlords just charge more in rent. And so the sort of crisis of poverty and homelessness just continued in that area. So there is just on a pure if we want to be successful, we need to work together. Because you can win wage increases, right, and in theory some workplace democracy through your ongoing contract negotiations. But if the labor union members, if your workers don't have security in their housing and don't have any sense that they're not going to just lose that to ever rising rents, then there's no benefit. So it is essential that we figure out how to work together. And I also think to the point of scale, labor unions, because of, you know, of so much hollowing of the sort of left in the U.S. over the past 100 years and the erasure of the socialist and communist party, labor unions are, at least they're not perfect, right? But there are an actual structural institution with scale and power and large membership. So there is also a lot of organizing opportunity if we can figure out how to work together. And I really do think that there's been some movement. Even in I will say in Vienna, we had members from 1199 from SEIU there with us. There's definitely people trying to make this happen. But I think it's essential to our success.
Great. I think this may be the last question. We'll see, unless you all give one-word answers. Yeah, which I doubt. I would wait. Yeah, wait till you hear the question too. Yeah, I mean, we've heard references, I think, to the socialist underpinnings of social housing, and Gianpaolo has gestured toward reparations. I guess my question is, how do you view social housing, the creation of a robust social housing program in relation to sort of a broader left political vision that can take us beyond neoliberalism? I mean, do we have to be talking about that if we're talking about this? Or can we talk about this narrowly and win it without the other stuff?
That feels like what do you call it? And neither answer is right, but it's like a combo kind of question. So I don't know, yes and yes. But I mean, I feel like housing, it's just such an easy thing to understand from like an emotional perspective, and people see it. Like we see like unhoused population every single day, like a lot of us, depending on where we live. And it's interesting, I talk to tech people a lot living in the Bay Area, but talking to tech people, like when you just tell them like, look, it's a human need, like water, when you tell them about Finland's housing first, and when you're just like, certain things shouldn't be a commodity, like because it's a basic human need, not like some other commodity. Like I think people, at least like the compassionate ones, like they get it. Like, so I just think it is a great inroad for just like, there are certain things that should be not like for profit and not dominated by the market. I do think this is a segue into just my own soapbox, but related. I think the movement's done a great job of demonizing corporate landlords. Like we know they're the problem, and I think that it's kind of like the puppets behind them that's harder to talk about. Like it's all about abstract stuff about Wall Street investors, housing financialization, derivatives, like all that stuff. But we need to address the whole entire thing. Like corporate landlords, like the reason why they're so evil is because investors are profiting, like demanding all these returns, right? Like the whole housing finance system needs to change. Like our whole way of looking at land as real estate, speculative, like wealth source, needs to change. And I know maybe this is overly idealistic, but that is not the only, like the government made a policy decision in the 1960s to turn to Wall Street to finance mortgages. Not all countries did that. A lot of countries like Germany, like most people bank with public banks, they bank with their cooperative bank. Most people in the US bank with like for-profit banks like Bank of America. That's a problem. But I mean, now that the US is like dominant in the global economic system, unfortunately, we have exported this way of linking real estate, like the financialization of housing around the world, and like has pushed this very hard policy-wise around the world. So if people are like, there is no other way, it's because like government decisions made it so. It's not that actually there's no other way. But I just wanted to just say again that like when we talk about making social housing pipelines, let's also talk about like alternate financing. Let's talk about setting up public banks. Let's talk about like getting rid of for-profit investors, because that's what's messing up the LIHTC system too, and like Blackstone buying up LIHTC and all that stuff.
I mean, I think it should be a core component of like left electoral politics, partly because I think it's successful. I mean, I think when you think about the sort of moderate Dems or sort of like more corporate Democratic elected officials, you don't really get that excited about their platforms. But I think it a little bit speaks to the question from the earlier panel too about like co-optation of the message, right? Because it is when you live in I actually don't know if this is like where it is everywhere, but in New York City, in both like our state and city level, you really don't, elected officials don't really frequently have to like have a floor vote and like give their opinion on what they think about sort of different like housing policies, right? Like things are negotiated behind closed doors with the leadership of the legislative bodies. So it's very easy to sort of run on a platform of housing for the public good, social housing, and not really mean it. So there is like a tension there, but I also think that that's what we've called out, I think, in a shift in politics in the last 10 years. And it is sort of like gotten to a place where lots of people who used to be able, I think, to say the right things but never actually deliver on them or deliver to their communities feel a bit more pressure. So I think it is central. to like left politics, and it is like it's what people care about. It is like the major crisis that's facing everyone across this country is that they cannot afford to live, and like you feel that in your housing, right? I mean, there's tons of other crises around not affording to live, not having health care, right? But housing just continues to be the main issue for so many people. So I think it is central that we also kind of develop these ideas further, right? And I think that's like what we're trying to do is to say this is what we mean, not this, so that we can like really try to own the concept without it getting watered down and sort of taken away from us by people who actually don't want to do it in the way that we know it has to be done.
Okay, so I'm originally from Right to the City, and there used to be this saying, the professor's on tap, not on top. I'm going to make an ideological statement, but I take my leadership from the movement. So it fits in the left vision a couple ways. One, we got to have housing as social good, as part of a good society. Elizabeth Warren version. I feel like we can move the electeds that way. We're going to have robust public action, public backing for strong projects to lift people out of poverty and allow communities to thrive. But I think it can also be part of our left vision, which is the struggle to decommodify our lives. So it's decommodifying housing, it's decommodifying the environment, it's decommodifying money. So to me, I think that's where this movement can go. And I tend to think that us establishing that baseline of housing as a basic social good that we all have is perfect fertile ground for that next sort of move.
Thank you all. I think we're almost at time. I don't know if you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to offer, or if you think we should go and eat.
Well, I want to thank everyone who put up with this on-the-fly organizing. So thank you, Amy. Thank you, Celeste. Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone. Andrew, are you going to ask a final good question? We're going to do it as we drink.